Hauptmann Werner Hoffman pressed his face against the cold steel of his Tiger tank's viewport, watching the September morning mist rise from the fields near Arracourt, France. The date was September 19, 1944, and the 32-year-old veteran of the Eastern Front had spent the last 3 years perfecting the art of armored warfare. His Tiger tank, one of the most feared weapons in the German arsenal, mounted an 88mm gun capable of destroying any Allied tank at ranges exceeding 2 kilometers. The 60-ton behemoth beneath him represented the pinnacle of German engineering, a mobile fortress that had earned a reputation for invincibility on battlefields from North Africa to the Russian steppes. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Through the dissipating fog, Hoffman could make out the shapes of American Sherman tanks positioned across the rolling terrain. He counted 5 of them, their distinctive silhouettes unmistakable even at this distance. A thin smile crossed his lips. The Americans had stumbled into a killing ground, and they didn't even know it. Behind Hoffman's position, spread across the wooded hills and concealed in the morning shadows, were elements of the Fifth Panzer Army, including more than 40 Tiger and Panther tanks. The Americans, with their inferior Shermans, were about to learn a brutal lesson about the realities of armored combat. Or so Hoffman thought. What happened over the next 4 hours would fundamentally challenge everything Werner Hoffman and thousands of German tank commanders had been taught about armored warfare, American military capabilities, and the nature of technological superiority itself. The battle that unfolded near the small French village of Arracourt would become one of the most lopsided tank engagements of World War II, but not in the way German commanders expected. By the time the autumn sun reached its zenith, the fields around Arracourt would be littered with the burning hulks of German tanks, and men like Hoffman would be forced to confront an uncomfortable truth that their training and ideology had deliberately obscured. The mythology surrounding German armor superiority had been carefully cultivated since the early days of the war. Every German tank commander had been indoctrinated with the belief that German tanks were qualitatively superior to anything the Allies could field. This wasn't mere propaganda, it was supported by what appeared to be solid technical specifications. The Tiger tank's 88mm gun could penetrate the frontal armor of a Sherman tank at ranges where the Sherman's 75mm gun was completely ineffective. On paper, a single Tiger could destroy multiple Shermans before they could even get close enough to return fire effectively. German training manuals emphasized these advantages repeatedly. At the Panzer Training School in Paderborn, instructors used detailed charts showing comparative armor thickness, gun penetration values, and engagement ranges. The numbers told a clear story. Tiger frontal armor measured 100 mm thick, angled for maximum effectiveness. Sherman frontal armor measured just 51 mm. At 1,500 meters, a Tiger could punch through a Sherman's armor with ease. At the same range, a Sherman shot would bounce harmlessly off a Tiger's glassy plate. The conclusion seemed inescapable. German armor was simply better. This technical superiority was reinforced by carefully selected combat reports from the Eastern Front. Stories circulated of single Tiger tanks destroying dozens of Soviet T-34s, of German tank aces with kill counts that seemed almost fantastical. Michael Wittmann's destruction of an entire British armored column at Villers-Bocage had become legendary within the Panzer forces. These narratives created a culture of confidence that bordered on arrogance among German tank crews. They believed they were driving the best tanks in the world, crewed by the best trained men, employing superior tactics developed through years of combat experience. What this narrative carefully omitted were the practical realities of armored warfare that couldn't be captured in specification sheets or triumphant after-action reports. It ignored the chronic mechanical unreliability that plagued German heavy tanks. It overlooked the logistical nightmares created by tanks so heavy they couldn't cross most bridges. It dismissed the significance of numbers, treating quantity as something that could always be overcome by quality. Most critically, it failed to account for the rapid evolution of American tactical doctrine and the practical advantages that came with operational flexibility rather than technical specifications. Werner Hoffman had absorbed all of these lessons during his training and had his beliefs reinforced through 3 years of combat. He had personally witnessed Tiger tanks shrugging off hits that would have destroyed lesser vehicles. He had seen Soviet tanks burning at ranges where they couldn't effectively fight back. When he looked at the 5 American Shermans in the valley below his position that September morning, he saw targets, not threats. His crew shared his confidence. His gunner, Feldwebel Klaus Richter, had already begun calculating range and wind deflection. His loader, Oberstfreiter Hans Mahler, had selected armor-piercing ammunition and stood ready. Everything was proceeding according to years of training and doctrine. The German attack plan for September 19 reflected this confidence. The Fifth Panzer Army had concentrated a massive armored force near Arracourt with the intention of smashing through the American Third Army's positions and disrupting their advance toward the German border. General Otto von Mancherfeld, commanding the Fifth Panzer Army, had assembled what should have been an overwhelming force. More than 200 tanks, including the cream of German armor, Tigers and Panthers, supported by infantry and artillery. Intelligence reports indicated that the Americans in the sector were relatively thinly spread, with the 4th Armored Division holding a wide front. Von Mancherfeld's plan called for concentrated thrusts at weak points, using the superior range and firepower of German heavy tanks to destroy American armor before it could effectively respond. On paper, the plan was sound. In the rigid mathematics of armor specifications and gun performance, German victories seemed almost inevitable. What the plan failed to account for was that the Americans had been learning, adapting, and developing tactics specifically designed to neutralize German armor advantages. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The Sherman tanks that Hoffman observed through his viewport weren't operating according to German expectations. They weren't charging forward in a desperate attempt to close range. They weren't sitting stationary, presenting easy targets. Instead, they were executing a carefully choreographed tactical ballet that German doctrine had never anticipated. Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams commanded the American armored forces in the Arracourt sector. The 29-year-old officer from Massachusetts had spent the past year studying every scrap of intelligence about German tank tactics and armor capabilities. He had read after-action reports from North Africa, from Italy, from Normandy. He had talked to British tank commanders who had faced Tigers and Panthers. He had studied the wreckage of destroyed German tanks, measuring armor thickness, examining internal layouts, identifying weak points. Abrams understood that his Shermans couldn't win a straightforward gunnery duel with German heavy tanks. So he had developed tactics that avoided straightforward gunnery duels. The American approach to armored warfare had evolved significantly since the early disasters in North Africa. The Sherman tank had earned a grim nickname among American crews, the Ronson, after the cigarette lighter company's advertising slogan, "Lights first time, every time." Early Shermans had a disturbing tendency to catch fire when penetrated, often with catastrophic results for the crew. By 1944, however, American tankers had learned to survive and even thrive despite their tanks' technical limitations. They had developed tactics that emphasized mobility over armor, coordination over individual firepower, and intelligence over brute force. The 5 Sherman tanks that Hoffman observed weren't alone, though that's what it looked like from his position. Concealed in tree lines and hull-down positions across the rolling terrain were dozens more American tanks, along with tank destroyers mounting high-velocity 76mm guns. American forward observers had already plotted the likely German approach routes and had artillery batteries registered on key terrain features. Most importantly, American intelligence had provided Abrams with detailed information about German tank dispositions, radio frequencies, and planned movements. The Americans knew the Germans were coming. They knew roughly how many tanks to expect. They had chosen their ground carefully and prepared a killing zone. When Hoffman gave the order to advance, his Tiger lurched forward with the characteristic rumble of its massive Maybach engine. Around him, spread across a frontage of nearly 2 kilometers, more than 40 German tanks began moving toward the American positions. The morning mist was clearing rapidly, promising good visibility for long-range gunnery. Everything seemed to be unfolding according to plan. Then the first Tiger exploded. Hoffman's radio crackled with a confused report from his company commander. Tank 214 had been hit and was burning. Before Hoffman could process this information, another Tiger erupted in flames, then another. The pattern made no sense. The American Shermans were still at extreme range, far beyond the effective reach of their main guns. How were German tanks being destroyed? The answer came in the form of a high-velocity round that struck the ground 3 meters in front of Hoffman's Tiger, sending up a shower of dirt and shrapnel. Tank destroyers. The Americans had positioned M18 Hellcat and M10 tank destroyers in concealed positions with overlapping fields of fire. These vehicles mounted high-velocity 76mm guns capable of penetrating Tiger armor at the flanks and rear. More importantly, they were fast, mobile, and operated according to a tactical doctrine of shoot and scoot. They would fire a few rounds from one position, then rapidly relocate before German gunners could return effective fire. The Americans weren't fighting the battle German doctrine anticipated. They weren't charging forward to engage in close-range slugging matches. They were using superior mobility and tactical positioning to negate German advantages in armor and gun power. Feldwebel Richter, Hoffman's gunner, frantically searched for targets through his optical sight. He could see the American Sherman tanks, but they were moving constantly, never presenting a stationary target for more than a few seconds. When he did manage to fire, his rounds struck earth where a Sherman had been moments before, or passed harmlessly through spaces the American tanks had already vacated. Meanwhile, German tanks continued to burn. The radio net dissolved into chaos as tank commanders reported losses, called for support, and struggled to understand what was happening. The American tactics were built on lessons learned through bitter experience. Each Sherman tank crew had been drilled endlessly in movement techniques, communication procedures, and mutual support tactics. They operated in coordinated teams, with some tanks providing suppressive fire while others maneuvered. They used terrain expertly, appearing from behind ridge lines just long enough to fire before dropping back into cover. When German tanks tried to close range to use their superior firepower, they found themselves channeled into pre-designated kill zones where American tank destroyers waited in ambush. Oberstfreiter Bruno Schmidt commanded a Panther tank in the formation advancing alongside Hoffman's Tiger. The 24-year-old loader from Hamburg had survived 2 years of combat on the Eastern Front, where German armor tactics had consistently proven effective against Soviet tanks. What was happening at Arracourt bore no resemblance to his previous combat experience. Soviet tanks had typically attacked in massed formations, presenting clear targets for German gunners. The Americans fought differently. They appeared and disappeared like ghosts, firing from unexpected angles, coordinating their movements with a precision that seemed almost choreographed. Schmidt watched in horror as the Panther directly in front of his position took a hit to its side armor. The tank lurched to a halt, smoke pouring from its engine compartment. He could see the crew bailing out, one man's uniform already ablaze. Before Schmidt could fully process what he was witnessing, his own tank shuddered from an impact on its rear quarter. The hit didn't penetrate, but it served as a terrifying reminder of their vulnerability. The Americans were shooting from multiple directions simultaneously. The carefully planned German advance had dissolved into confusion. The quantitative disparity that German propaganda had taught soldiers to discount was manifesting itself in brutal fashion. For every German tank on the battlefield, there were 3 or 4 American vehicles, including not just Shermans but also the faster, more lethal tank destroyers. American crews could afford to miss shots, to take risks, to expose themselves briefly because they had numbers on their side. German crews, operating supposedly superior vehicles, found themselves unable to concentrate their fire effectively because threats emerged from too many directions simultaneously. Lieutenant Franz Weber commanded an infantry platoon attached to the armored formation. His men were supposed to advance behind the tanks, mopping up any American infantry that survived the armored onslaught. Instead, Weber found himself ordering his men to take cover as American artillery began falling with devastating accuracy. The shells seemed to know exactly where German forces were concentrated. Unknown to Weber, American forward observers equipped with excellent radio communications were directing fire with a precision German forces hadn't experienced since the early days of the war. Every time German tanks clustered together, artillery rained down. Every time infantry tried to advance in support, high explosive shells scattered them. The psychological impact of the unexpected reversal was as devastating as the physical losses. German tank crews had gone into battle confident in their equipment and training. Within an hour, that confidence had evaporated. Radio discipline collapsed as commanders shouted contradictory orders, called for reinforcements, and reported catastrophic losses. Some units began withdrawing without orders, their commanders independently deciding that continued advance was suicide. The careful tactical plan that had looked so promising on map boards dissolved into chaos on the actual battlefield. Werner Hoffman's Tiger had so far avoided direct hits, but his situation was becoming increasingly desperate. His company had started the day with 12 Tigers. Within 2 hours, 7 were burning or abandoned. The Americans maintained constant pressure, never allowing German forces to consolidate or establish effective firing positions. Hoffman found himself constantly repositioning, trying to find angles where his superior gun range would matter, but the terrain and American tactics conspired against him. Every time he thought he had a clear shot, his target would disappear behind a ridge line or into a tree line. Meanwhile, American fire continued to find German targets with uncanny accuracy. The battle around Arracourt continued through the morning and into the afternoon. As the hours passed, the scale of the German defeat became increasingly apparent. Burning tanks littered the countryside, their crews either dead, wounded, or captured. The ground that was supposed to have been taken quickly and decisively remained firmly in American hands. The vaunted German armor superiority had been systematically dismantled by tactics, coordination, and numerical advantage. By mid-afternoon, what remained of the German armored force was in full retreat, leaving behind more than 40 destroyed or abandoned tanks. The 5 American Sherman tanks that had first drawn Hoffman's attention that morning were still operational when the fighting ended. Not because they were invulnerable, several had taken hits that damaged but didn't destroy them, but because their crews fought smart rather than brave. They had withdrawn when threatened, repositioned constantly, supported each other, and called in artillery when needed. They had done exactly what their training emphasized: survive and win through coordination rather than heroics. The Germans, fighting according to doctrine that emphasized individual tank superiority and aggressive advance, had been systematically destroyed. The 5 American Sherman tanks that had first drawn Hoffman's attention that morning were still operational when the fighting ended. Not because they were invulnerable, several had taken hits that damaged but didn't destroy them, but because their crews fought smart rather than brave. They had withdrawn when threatened, repositioned constantly, supported each other, and called in artillery when needed. They had done exactly what their training emphasized: survive and win through coordination rather than heroics. The Germans, fighting according to doctrine that emphasized individual tank superiority and aggressive advance, had been systematically destroyed. Hauptmann Hoffman sat in his Tiger tank as darkness fell over the battlefield, surrounded by the wreckage of what had been one of Germany's premier armored formations. The silence after the battle was more unsettling than the chaos of combat had been. No engine sounds from advancing vehicles. No radio chatter coordinating movements. Just the occasional crack of burning ammunition cooking off in destroyed tanks and the distant sounds of American vehicles consolidating their positions. Hoffman had survived the day, but something fundamental inside him had been destroyed along with those 40 German tanks scattered across the French countryside. The immediate aftermath of the battle revealed the true scale of the disaster. German forces had lost 43 tanks at Arracourt, including 26 Panthers and 17 Tigers. American losses totaled 7 Shermans and 3 tank destroyers. The kill ratio that German propaganda had promised, where superior German armor would destroy multiple inferior American tanks, had been completely inverted. For every American vehicle knocked out, more than 4 German tanks had been destroyed. These weren't the statistics of a close-fought engagement between roughly equal forces. These were the numbers of a massacre. Oberleutnant Gustav Hartmann survived the battle commanding a Panther that had thrown a track while attempting to retreat from American fire. He and his crew had abandoned the vehicle and made their way back to German lines on foot, a humiliating 5-kilometer walk past burning German tanks and through terrain the Americans now controlled. In his after-action report filed 3 days later, Hartmann struggled to explain what had happened. His superiors demanded answers. How had such a powerful armored force been defeated so decisively? Hartmann's report was brutally honest in ways that contradicted years of German military doctrine and propaganda. The Americans did not fight as we anticipated. Our training emphasized that American tank crews were poorly trained, that their tactics were unimaginative, and that their equipment was inferior. None of these assumptions proved accurate. American crews demonstrated excellent coordination, with tanks supporting each other in ways we have only seen from our most elite units. They used terrain masterfully, appearing only when they had advantages and withdrawing before we could bring superior firepower to bear. Most critically, they had numerical superiority that allowed them to attack from multiple directions simultaneously while we struggled to identify priority targets. Hartmann's report also noted something that senior German officers found particularly disturbing. American artillery response times were dramatically faster than German intelligence had predicted. When German tanks concentrated for an attack, American high-explosive shells arrived within minutes, sometimes within seconds. This suggested a level of communication and coordination between ground observers and artillery batteries that exceeded what German forces could currently achieve. The Americans were demonstrating not just material superiority but systemic advantages in how they organized and employed their forces. The statistical evidence that emerged in subsequent weeks painted an even grimmer picture of German armored capabilities relative to American forces. The Battle of Arracourt wasn't an isolated incident but the opening engagement of a sustained armored battle that would continue through late September. Over 10 days of fighting around Arracourt, German forces would lose more than 200 tanks while inflicting losses of fewer than 50 American vehicles. The consistent 4-to-1 or 5-to-1 loss ratio demolished any remaining illusions about German tank superiority. Panzer crew survival rates told an equally disturbing story. German tankers at Arracourt experienced casualty rates exceeding 40%, with many crews losing multiple members killed or severely wounded. American tank crew casualties were significantly lower, in part because Sherman tanks, despite their reputation for catching fire, had been progressively improved with better fire suppression systems and ammunition storage. More importantly, American doctrine emphasized crew survival, with training that focused on rapid evacuation when vehicles were hit. German doctrine, by contrast, encouraged crews to fight until their vehicles were completely disabled, a philosophy that led to higher casualty rates when tanks were penetrated. The mechanical reliability disparity became glaringly apparent in the days following the initial engagement. German heavy tanks, particularly the Tiger, suffered from chronic mechanical problems that became acute under combat conditions. Transmission failures, engine breakdowns, and track problems plagued German armor. Of the 43 German tanks lost at Arracourt on September 19, at least 8 had been abandoned due to mechanical failure rather than combat damage. These vehicles, too heavy to be easily recovered and too complex to be repaired in field conditions, were simply left behind as the German forces retreated. American maintenance operations, by contrast, demonstrated remarkable efficiency. Sherman tanks that had been damaged or broken down during the battle were often back in service within 24 to 48 hours. American armored divisions included extensive mobile maintenance units with the tools, parts, and expertise to conduct field repairs quickly. The standardization of American equipment meant that parts from one vehicle could often be used to repair another. German vehicles, built to tighter tolerances and incorporating more complex systems, required specialized tools and parts that were increasingly difficult to obtain as the war progressed. Feldwebel Martin Kessler, a tank recovery specialist with the Fifth Panzer Army, spent the nights following the battle attempting to recover disabled German tanks before American forces could capture them. His experiences illuminated another critical disadvantage German forces faced. We had orders to recover as many vehicles as possible, particularly the Tigers, which represented enormous investments of resources and manufacturing time. The problem was that Tigers weigh 60 tons. Our recovery vehicles, designed for lighter tanks, struggled to move them, especially across soft ground. We managed to recover 3 Panthers, but had to abandon 4 Tigers that had relatively minor damage because we simply couldn't move them before the Americans advanced. The Americans, Kessler noted in his diary, seemed to treat damaged tanks as disposable. They would strip useful parts and equipment, then simply abandon hulks that would have represented months of German manufacturing effort. This casual approach to equipment reflected a fundamental difference in industrial capacity. Germany was struggling to produce 50 tanks per month by September 1944. American factories were producing more than 2,000. When an American Sherman was lost, it could be replaced within days. When a German Tiger was lost, it might take months to produce a replacement, if materials were even available. Intelligence assessments compiled after Arracourt forced German commanders to confront uncomfortable realities about American armored forces. Major Wilhelm Brandt, an intelligence officer assigned to analyze the battle, produced a classified report that directly contradicted previous German intelligence estimates. His findings were shared only with senior commanders, but they represented a fundamental reassessment of American capabilities. Previous intelligence estimates characterized American armored forces as numerically strong but qualitatively weak, relying on mass rather than skill or technology. The Battle of Arracourt demonstrates this assessment was fundamentally flawed. American tank crews demonstrated tactical sophistication equal to or exceeding our own forces. Their coordination between armor, tank destroyers, artillery, and infantry was seamless. Most concerning, their intelligence and reconnaissance capabilities allowed them to predict and counter our movements with disturbing accuracy. We must conclude that American forces have achieved a level of tactical and operational effectiveness that matches or exceeds our own. Brandt's report included detailed analysis of American radio communications, which German signals intelligence had intercepted during the battle. The Americans were using frequency hopping techniques and sophisticated encryption that made their communications difficult to intercept and nearly impossible to decode in real time. This communications security, combined with excellent radio discipline, meant that German commanders often had better intelligence about their own forces than about American dispositions. The Americans, meanwhile, seemed to have detailed knowledge of German movements, suggesting they had broken German communications security. The comparison of doctrine and training methods revealed additional American advantages that German officers had previously dismissed. American armored forces trained using realistic combat simulations, with extensive live-fire exercises that consumed vast quantities of ammunition. German training, constrained by fuel and ammunition shortages, increasingly relied on classroom instruction and limited practical exercises. By 1944, many German tank crews were arriving at the front with fewer than 50 hours of actual driving time and minimal gunnery training. American crews typically had hundreds of hours of training before seeing combat. Lieutenant Peter Vogel, a 22-year-old Tiger commander who had received his commission just 3 months before Arracourt, exemplified the training disparities. He had attended abbreviated officer training that focused heavily on doctrine and theory but provided limited practical experience. His first time commanding a Tiger in actual combat conditions was at Arracourt. When asked during debriefing about his training, Vogel's response was telling. We learned that the Tiger was superior to all Allied tanks. We learned the specifications, the armor thicknesses, the gun performance. What we did not learn was what to do when the Americans refused to fight the battle our doctrine anticipated. We were trained to fight the War of 1942, not the War of 1944. The psychological impact of the Arracourt defeat rippled through German armored forces across the entire Western Front. Tank crews who had believed themselves to be operating the finest fighting vehicles in the world suddenly confronted evidence that suggested otherwise. This crisis of confidence manifested in multiple ways, from increased caution in combat to outright reluctance to engage American armor under unfavorable conditions. Officers reported declining morale and increasing skepticism about official reports of German technological superiority. Oberstfreiter Hans Müller, a Tiger loader who survived Arracourt, wrote a letter to his brother that was intercepted by American censors. The letter provided insight into the psychological state of German tank crews after the battle. They told us the Tiger was invincible, that American tanks were death traps, that we had nothing to fear from American armor. At Arracourt, I watched Tigers burning just as easily as any other tank. I watched American shells penetrating armor we were told was impenetrable. I saw American tanks moving with speed and coordination we were told they didn't possess. Everything we were told was a lie, and good men died because of those lies. The logistical realities underlying the battle became clearer as German intelligence compiled more complete information about American supply operations. The Americans had established a logistics network of stunning efficiency, capable of delivering thousands of tons of supplies daily to forward positions. American armored divisions consumed fuel, ammunition, and spare parts at rates that would have bankrupted German logistics within days. Yet American supply columns kept rolling, seemingly endless convoys of trucks delivering everything frontline units needed. Hauptmann Joseph Steiner, a logistics officer with the Fifth Panzer Army, studied captured American supply documents after Arracourt. His analysis revealed operational capabilities that German forces could only envy. The Americans maintained supply levels that allow their tank units to operate continuously without concern for ammunition expenditure or fuel consumption. A single American armored division consumes more fuel in a day than my entire army receives in a week. They fire artillery ammunition at a rate that would exhaust our entire monthly allocation in 48 hours. Their maintenance units carry more spare parts than we have in our entire theater depot system. We are not fighting a wealthier enemy. We are fighting an enemy whose industrial and logistical capabilities exist on a different scale entirely. The technological improvements in Sherman tanks that had occurred between 1942 and 1944 had largely gone unnoticed by German intelligence. The Shermans that fought at Arracourt were significantly improved compared to the tanks that had first faced German armor in North Africa. Better armor layouts, improved ammunition storage, more powerful guns on later variants, and enhanced fire suppression systems had transformed the Sherman from a death trap into a reasonably survivable platform. German intelligence, focused on developing counters to the Sherman tanks of 1942, had failed to track these incremental but cumulatively significant improvements. American tank destroyers, which had played such a critical role at Arracourt, represented another technology that German intelligence had systematically underestimated. The M18 Hellcat, mounting a high-velocity 76mm gun on a chassis capable of speeds exceeding 50 miles per hour, could penetrate Tiger armor from the side or rear. Its mobility allowed it to employ shoot-and-scoot tactics that negated German advantages in armor protection. The M10, though slower, mounted the same gun in greater numbers. Together, these tank destroyers provided American forces with mobile anti-tank capability that exceeded German expectations. The artillery coordination that had so devastated German forces at Arracourt reflected years of American doctrinal development and training. Forward observers with American armored units could call for artillery fire and have shells impacting within 3 to 5 minutes. The Americans had developed standardized procedures for fire missions, trained radio operators extensively in communication protocols, and equipped their forces with reliable radio equipment. German artillery, though technically excellent, suffered from communication delays, ammunition shortages, and an increasingly disrupted command structure. American artillery could deliver 10 times the shells in half the time. Oberst Heinrich Vogelsang, commander of an artillery regiment supporting the armored attack at Arracourt, filed a report that highlighted the artillery disparity. American counter-battery fire suppressed our gun positions within minutes of our opening fire. Their forward observers called in strikes with accuracy that suggests excellent training in communications equipment. Most critically, they had ammunition to expend freely while we were under orders to conserve shells. In one engagement, American artillery fired an estimated 1,200 rounds in support of their armor. We fired 87 rounds in the same period, not because we lacked targets but because we lacked ammunition. Superior equipment matters little when you cannot afford to use it. The intelligence breakdown that had allowed American forces to predict and counter German movements at Arracourt revealed another systematic failure. German operational security had been compromised at multiple levels. American intelligence had broken German radio codes, allowing them to intercept and decode communications. American reconnaissance aircraft, operating with near impunity due to Allied air superiority, photographed German assembly areas and tracked vehicle movements. Local French resistance provided detailed reports on German dispositions and movements. The Germans, operating in hostile territory without effective air reconnaissance and with compromised communications, were fighting largely blind while the Americans enjoyed near-perfect battlefield awareness. The cumulative weight of evidence from Arracourt forced even the most dedicated German officers to acknowledge that American armored forces had evolved into formidable opponents who could not be dismissed as technically inferior or poorly trained. This recognition triggered a broader reevaluation of American military capabilities that extended far beyond armored warfare. If German intelligence had been so wrong about American tanks, what else might they be wrong about? This question haunted German commanders as they struggled to understand how the war had turned so decisively against them. The human cost of the Arracourt defeat extended beyond casualty statistics. German tank crews who survived the battle carried psychological scars that affected their combat effectiveness in subsequent engagements. Officers reported that crews were increasingly reluctant to engage American armor aggressively, preferring defensive positions where they could use their superior gun range. This tactical caution, while rational given the realities of armored combat, contradicted German doctrine that emphasized aggressive maneuver and decisive engagement. The German armored forces that had conquered France in 1940 through bold offensive action were, by late 1944, increasingly fighting defensively because offensive operations had proven catastrophically costly. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.